Good morning. Good morning. How are you? This is Rebecca Enonchong. I am here as one of the members of the ABAN board, also as part of the VC for Africa board. I'm involved in many different organizations to support technology entrepreneurship and the startup community on the African continent. And today I have the honor of having this chat, this discussion with Dr. Acha Leke, who is from my home country, from Cameroon. He is the chairman of McKinsey Africa and has been very involved in a lot of the macro decisions on the continent. I think that many have referred to him as the advisor to presidents. I'm not sure that there are many Africans, if any, that have been advisors to so many heads of state. So we are so honored to have Acha Leke with us today. We're going to be talking about the Africa Rising story. We're going to be talking about the investment climate. So welcome, Acha. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us today.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So, well, let's get started. I talked about Africa Rising. If people haven't read your book, they should read it here. The Africa Business Revolution, How to Succeed in the World's Next Big Growth Market. This is an amazing book, but it is an Africa Rising book. It's very optimistic. It really presents, Africa as the opportunity, and really then goes into advice, really very concrete advice for investors on how to take advantage of that opportunity. But this Africa Rising story, like we're optimists, right? The community that you have watching you today is super optimistic and has really bought into the Africa Rising story. But there's also a reality. We see what's happening on the ground. We see what's happening in Nigeria, in Cameroon, in Tanzania, in Guinea, in Cote d'Ivoire. So you when you see some of this conflicting information, that is, so you still have the Africa Rising story, but then next to it you have this story where the youth don't feel helped. You're an advisor to presidents, to heads of states, but what would you tell the young people? What would you tell the youth that feel so discouraged? What would you tell them about the Africa Rising story?
I think it's first, like I said, Rebecca, thanks for having me on. And I think it's a fundamental question that a lot of people are thinking about now, right? And I think the first point is, if you look at where we are today versus where we were 10, 15 years ago, I think people will generally agree that we're on a positive trajectory. I think it's hard, and you look at the facts, right? You look at the facts around GDP growth, look at the facts around, reduction in maternal mortality, look at the facts around education attainment levels and literacy levels. It's hard to argue that we've not made progress in the last 10, 15, 20 years. Now, the truth is we are not where we want to be, and that's very, very clear. And the fact is, Africa has 54 countries. So when we talk about Africa, we always talk as sort of an aggregate. But it's 54 countries, and you'll have some that are doing well and some that are not doing as well, right? So my first message is we are in a very different position from where we were 10, 15 years ago. I think that's what we recognize. And that's part of a lot of what we've written about, is to, from a fact-based perspective, show that, to make sure the world knows where we are. Because typically what is talked about, we talked about it in the book. We looked at what was written about Africa in one of the big sort of global newspapers in 1 week. I think it was 2017, 2018. And there were 5 articles written, right? And all 5 were negative, right? One was about the Boko Haram crisis. One was about corruption, I think, in Angola, the DRC. 2 were about conflicts. And 1 was about the migrants trying to get into Europe. And we always say, those stories are important to tell, but on their own, they don't tell the full story of the continent, right? So the facts tell a bit of a different story. So that's true. Now, having said that, we have some fundamental issues we need to address, right? And you've talked about some of them. There's some fundamental issues on the economic growth front. There's some fundamental issues on the social inclusion front. How do you translate economic growth to more inclusive growth? The huge issues on the jobs front. There are a number of issues on the enablers, on the infrastructure, and everywhere you look, there's some issues, right? But where I gain comfort and excitement is if you look at sort of just some of the core trends, right? Look at the population trend on the continent, right? We are 1 out of 6 people in the world is African. We're going to be 1 out of 4 by 2050. We'll be 1 out of 3 by the end of the century. If you look at the trend on urbanization, we're the fastest urbanizing region in the world. If you look at the trend on infrastructure, right? We're spending $80 billion per year, roughly dollars per year on infrastructure. We used to spend $40 billion. We're not spending $150 billion, right? So you look at some of the trends, and that gives you comfort that we're going in the right direction, right? But to your point again, still a lot needs to be done.
So now from your advising heads of state, what would you give them to say, this is how we can propel the continent? This is how your country can improve, without being specific on the countries. What types of recommendations would you make to them so that we can accelerate this growth that you're so excited about and we're all excited about?
I mean, there are a number of, first, I think it depends per country, right? But there's some things that cut across, right? So if you look at the challenge we have in our economies, I always say that, 2 big challenges we have. One, there's a challenge of leadership, right? So how do you make sure you have the right people, leading these economies, both on the public sector and the private sector front? But, and the reason that's an issue is because, when you don't have strong institutions, the impact of one leader is massive, right? So you look at, places, even the US, we talk about what's happening there, but, you have strong institutions there that, keep the leader in check. And when in some of our countries you don't have strong institutions, the leader it makes a big difference, right? So that's why we believe developing the leaders of tomorrow for Africa is important. And that's why some of the work I've done with Fred Swanek and a few others around leadership, the African Leadership Academy, African Leadership University, or the network are important. So that's one, but that's again a longer term play. In the short term, the challenge our countries face is the challenge of execution, right? All of our countries have visions, all of our countries have plans. My colleagues and I have worked on a number of these plans in a number of the countries. The difference between those that have been successful and those that have not is the question of execution, right? And so a lot of what we spend time on is helping the leaders on the public sector and the private sector to think about how do you execute these programs, right? How do you set up a unit that can drive execution? How do you hold people accountable to execute on it? How do you, make sure that when things don't happen, you intervene quite soon? How do you follow through on it, right? You have some leaders who say, okay, here's the vision, and then they disappear and nothing happens. And you have others who, know what's happening in every single project in the country, right? And they're on top of it, right? So how do you, I think the execution mechanism is what we spend a lot of time helping a number of countries put in place such that we can actually realize this vision, right? Because, you have these visions, we have these plans, but the challenge has always come down to execution. So that's one of the big messages we share. The second is the collaboration of the private sector, right? Government can only do so much, right? So how do you work more closely with the private sector? And the good news coming out of COVID is you've seen a lot more, public-private partnerships, right? So the private sector came to the table in most of our countries, right? Even across the continent to say, look, let's work with government to help address the crisis. And so, how the government encourage the private sector, how do they support them? How do they create much more of an enabling environment for the private sector to thrive, right? And then how do they then get out of the way and let the private sector drive things? So that's a lot of the discussions we're having with these leaders. And the third, and there are many others, but the third I'll talk about is very much more of a Pan-African collaboration. We talk about, continent, it's 54 countries, right? And many of them are just upscale. And so, and individually, we just don't have enough of a weight, right? But we saw again during the COVID, the crisis, we saw that when we came together, right? When countries were trying to go buy, whether it's ventilators at the time, or they were trying to buy test kits at the beginning, and we're just getting squeezed out of the market. But when the continent came together and said, okay, now it's 1.2 billion people want to go negotiate, whether it's with China or with Germany or somewhere else, to this, and we want to do it, from sort of at that level, things opened up for us, right? So really the power of us playing the game at the continental level, speaking with one voice and being much more united is something that we've been pushing through the leaders, but also through the African Union.
Speaking of that, the trade agreement, how much impact do you think it will have? Do you think it will actually, you talked about execution earlier, do you really think that we can execute on this dream? Because, so many in the startup community are waiting for this because it's a huge opportunity for cross-border transactions and trade. Do you think it will actually happen other than just on paper and in theory?
Good question. The answer is yes. I'm an optimist, right?
That was a real question. I'm sorry.
No, I said that the answer for me is yes. Now, what I always say, so the trade agreement is absolutely, to your point, critical for the startup community, but I think for private sector in general, right? Our markets are small. And so, there's a huge need for us to create one big continental market, which is what the AFCFTA is all about. Now, I always say, the process to get us to signing the treaties and ratifying it, people thought it was a difficult process to try to convince countries to do it and all of that. Honestly, that's the easy part, right? The hard part starts now, to your point. How do you then translate that in practice? How do you make sure, when a truck leaves from, Lagos and is making its way to Ouaga or to Conakry, that, it goes through borders, in a seamless way? That's the hard part, right? And so I think, just saying it, if we, then it's back to the execution part. How do you make it happen? Because yes, we'll come and say we signed it and, theoretically, there's a big market, but it's about doing practice. And so we think the answer again here is, we believe in these flagship projects. What are the kind of projects you're going to launch that you're going to actually execute on and create early visible momentum, right? Is it, a highway, right? From these, from one country to across the West Africa, across East Africa, where, the way you cross into the different countries is very, very different, right? And it shows that we're doing things differently. And I think it's very important to create such early momentum with some of these projects. Is it more facilitating travel amongst Africans, for Africans to travel across the continent, right? Is it that? But we think it's very important to find a few visible projects that will make a big difference, that get executed. People then get excited about it and say, wow, look at how much has changed because of this. And how do we then continue to make it happen? So again, I think it comes down to what we talked about earlier, which is yes, vision is there, yes, on paper is there, yes, now it's signed. And now with the Secretariat in Accra and getting going hopefully in January, it's about execution, and we got to make it happen.
So one of the early wins, you talked about being able to find one way to get an early win, to get the momentum going. Wouldn't digital be a priority? In that it's something that can be done with signed papers versus having to build out infrastructure and build roads and so on and so forth. I'm thinking, for instance, about fintech, where today we have 41 central banks. And if you have a product or a payment system that works in one country, and you have to go through that entire approval process, but you can't use that approval to go across the border because you have to deal with a new central bank and go through all of those approvals again. Would I argue that digital is digital regulations facilitating that, allowing those companies that have gone through and gotten the approval from one central bank to be able to carry that over to other countries and other markets would be a very, very quick win that would make an incredible difference on the continent. What do you think about digital, about this using the trade agreement to push and start with very digital projects that can have a quick win?
I mean, I hear you talk about two things, though. I hear you talk about harmonization of regulations, and I hear you talk about digital as an enabler, right? I think both are absolutely critical, right? So that's about, if it's not just harmonization across the board, right? So we're doing some work now with Africa CDC looking at, we talk about getting access to vaccines in Africa, right? The corona vaccine, and once it's going to be available, how do we make sure that, the people who need it have access to it and it doesn't just stay in the global north and, we get it later. But then how do you make sure these vaccines are approved in the different countries, right? So if you have to go one, approval agency for another, how long is that going to take? Is there a way to do it at a Pan-African level where we recognize it at an African level and countries then, support that, right? And go. So the number, and this is just the vaccines, to your point, in many other, of the payment type platforms and all of that, there's a huge need for harmonization, right? Drugs, right? When you want to, register a drug in a country, if it's registered at an aggregate level, can countries then recognize that versus having to go in each country and register? And you can go across the board, right? So I think harmonization of these regulations, and those are actually easier things to do, right? Because it's about getting a law, getting it passed, getting countries to recognize it. I think that's easier generally to do. Your second point on digital for me is absolutely critical, right? So we did some work we did quite a bit of work with sort of cover the impact on the continent, how many jobs could be lost, impact from a GDP perspective, impact on companies. But we also started to say, look, let's think about reimagining Africa. What could Africa look like coming out of the crisis, right? And what opportunity does it create, right? We identified sort of nine big ideas across, reimagining business, reimagining society, and reimagining government. By far, the biggest idea here that is digital, right? COVID for us, it's really accelerating Africa's digital transformation, right? Because we found that countries and companies that were more digitally advanced coming into the crisis just fared better, right? Because we're able to pivot the business and the operations, very, very quickly. And we see now that, everybody's talking about digital, right? Some of my clients on the public sector front are driving a big digitalization agenda across the entire country because they know that we will face another crisis and, digital is going to be the way out, right? It's going to actually help us through the crisis. And so, yes, I totally agree. Digital for me is a massive opportunity, right? It's on a number of things, right? It helps simplify citizen processes and just makes it a much better experience for citizens. Imagine if you wanted to get a passport in Cameroon during the crisis, how would you, right? Everything was closed, right? What could you do there? Imagine what else you can do if you want to open a bank account, if you want to, payments, right? What happened with payments and how they took off, digital payments through the crisis. So I think the whole digital theme is a massive one. And the good news is we're seeing a lot of private sector players starting to embrace it as much as we're seeing public sector players embrace it even more, right, in some of our country, right? So I think I'm totally agree with you, but I think it's, there's a harmonization of regulation on one side. For me, there's a digital as an enabler, but that's across everything. And what can we do to leverage digital a lot more across our countries?
But do you think that they get it? Like, when you speak with the policymakers, and I think in theory, they all say and promote and talk about digital as this great opportunity. But then when you see the types of policies that they actually implement that are sometimes contrary to that vision, I feel sometimes that they don't really understand. I mean, because they've had to use the technology themselves to connect and communicate during the crisis. Perhaps now they're more and more will get it, but do you really feel like as a majority, they really understand this digital world and the opportunity and what is needed in order to make sure that digital can thrive? Digital as an industry, not just as a tool, but as an industry, because we're here talking about, we're talking to investors, most of whom invest in digital, but digital as business and digital as an industry, do you think that it's recognized as such in amongst policymakers?
Yeah, first, I think my experience is you don't need all policymakers to buy into it, right? You're never going to get all policymakers to buy into it. You need those who matter to understand it and make it happen, right? And that's and generally in many of these things, again, for policy, it has to start at the top, right? You see what's happening in Rwanda. You see people who get it and want to make things happen, right? You see actually what Togo is doing now, right? With the new VC program they launched very quickly to, you go to Togo, I was there last week, and it's quite interesting, how you show up and you have to download the Togo Safe app and you have to show that, and then be self-quarantine until you get your results and they can track it through the app. It's just amazing what they're doing through digital, right? And there are a couple of countries like that, but I think for me, it's about you're never getting everybody to buy into it, right, or really understand the value of it. But you need the people who matter to do it, right? And for me, it's how do you get more of the people who matter to embrace it, understand the value? That's one. Two is the value about we all look at each other and see what's happening, right? So people are saying, why is this happening in one country? Why can't we do it? It's much easier to do it here. Why is it that hard for us to do in our country? So I think there's really that tension, which is positive, which is there's some positive tension that's created when you see some countries leveraging digital a lot and others are saying, well, why can't we do it? I think you'll always have a set of folks who would, for whatever reason, because it also digital, if digital processes, it actually helps to eliminate leakages, right? Some people actually thrive on the fact that leakages exist. And so there's a vested interest in some cases not to push it. And that's why, I always come back to this. For me, it comes back to a leadership problem, right? That's the issue we have. It's like when you have the countries and the areas where you have the right set of leaders who embrace it, who want to do the right thing, understand the value of doing it, we get it done. And areas where you don't have that, either you'll struggle and you'll try to convince them that this is the right thing to do, and you'll convince one person and the other person is going to block it. So that's going to be harder, right? So again, when we're talking as an investor, it's also understanding as you put money, where are the areas where you want to invest, because you want it to be in places where there's that enabling environment. There are the policymakers who would be supportive of it, and that there's enough of them, hopefully, and there are starting to be enough of them across the continent if you look at more of a Pan-African type deal or Pan-African type investments.
In countries like the US or some European countries, there are incentives for private investors to encourage investment in startups or in other people's businesses. Are you starting to see any of that happening on the continent? Are you starting to see governments starting to give thought to how to create these incentives for angel investment, for early stage investment, risky investment, incentives for the investors to encourage this activity? Is there any movement there?
Yeah, it's funny because I think early stage investing is probably one of the biggest challenges we have, right? Across country. Very few people are putting it better than I do, right? I'm putting money in the space, right? And people always say, these startups trying to get money, they went to a bank, they try to raise money. And I was just like, when Zuckerberg founded Facebook, he didn't go to a bank. He didn't go to Bank of America to get a loan, right? When Larry and Sergey founded Google, right, they didn't go to Wachovia to get a loan, right? There's setups there, and the early stage investors actually put in money. And many of these are actually previous entrepreneurs themselves, right? Who have then decided, okay, this is the way I want to promote entrepreneurship, but I also want to make some good money, right? But I also want to promote entrepreneurship. I think that's what we're lacking in Africa, right? We always talk about, this bank is not supported. That's not the role of the bank. The role of the bank, honestly, is not to go and fund a risky startup venture, right? But how do you then encourage? I think first is, we can talk about incentives for individuals to do it. And I think for me, that's the second stage. I think the first stage is how do you encourage first entrepreneurs who've been successful to figure out what do they need to do to back the next set of entrepreneurs, right? For two reasons. One, because you want to support entrepreneurship, but two is because it can actually, help make you even more money if that's what's important to you, right? Then the second is how do you then, put in place mechanisms to encourage, more investors to come in, right? Whether it's incentives, whether it's, tax incentives, whether it's different programs, to get more retail investors to come to the space. But I think, focusing towards incentives, we'll go create the laws in the country to say, you'll get a tax break and all of that. I don't think that's what's going to get us there, honestly. But, my perspective is the first step is how do you get more of our entrepreneurs who've been successful to view this as partly the right thing for me to do to support other entrepreneurs, but also this is sort of an asset class I should invest in because, it can actually give me a good return.
So speaking of that, so you have the entrepreneurs, which, would be a startup, which we're starting to have that generation of entrepreneurs that have been successful, and that will certainly invest in future startups. We're really starting to see that. There was a great exit recently. I don't know if you heard about Paystack, but Paystack, there were a lot
absolutely, it's great.
There were a lot of local investors that had put in money from 2015, 2017, and so there will be a real trickle down, I think, in real impact in that ecosystem, and we're starting to see that. But also, I think that there are other high net worth individuals that may not be, that we would refer to more as business people versus referring to them as entrepreneurs, that for whatever reason have not bought into the opportunity in investing in early stage startups. What can we tell? You know a lot more of those high net worth individuals than any of us watching today. What would you tell us to tell them, to convince them that there is an opportunity? How can we convince them?
Well, this, first, for me, it's first understanding why they're not investing. But I'm with you. I think part of that's the challenge. You have these, successful entrepreneurs who don't see this as an avenue for them to support the next generation of entrepreneurs and also, make a good return, right? So the question is, why is it, right? Is it because they have better investment opportunities? Is it because, they don't feel like this is structured enough? So I think spending a bit of time understanding what the challenge is. The good news is you have a number that have started to try it out, right? So I'm with some of the entrepreneurs. I'm actually invested in Aggressive Capital, right? It's a private equity fund that actually invested. It's an early stage VC fund that actually invested in Paystack, which has been great. So I think, you're getting people to taste it a bit and then figure out, you can actually make some good returns. And then on the back of that, they may do more, right? But then I think, we also need to make sure that, there's we love the Paystack story, but the question is, how many of those stories are there, right? I think, it's also a chicken and egg, right? How do you get many more Paystack type stories where people then get excited and say, oh, wow, this is interesting. Why am I missing out on this, right? I probably should try a bit and come in. So I think there's an element of the industry as it evolves, industry makes sure the industry is successful, right? So, a lot of people came with sort of private equity and put some money, and now there's been some noise, to be honest, if we're honest with each other, about, returns of private equity in Africa. And there are a bunch of different reasons why that is, right? So how do you avoid that happening to the venture capital industry? Because I think if you go down that path, then it's going to be even harder. So all this to say, I think understanding why they're not investing and what it will take, I think creating more Paystack type stories for them to see that, this is an interesting space to come in and this could be good for you. And then as the industry evolves, what does the industry body need to do versus the different, individual investors or VC firms? What does the industry together need to do to make sure that it's successful as an industry versus as individual players? I think will be something I'd say you should focus on as well.
So my goodness, thank you so much for all this great advice and the opportunity to dig into your mind a little bit. Thank you for the time that you spent with us here. So VC for Africa, ABAN, we thank you, Acha, Leke, for joining us today. Also the entire community that's watching, thank you so much for joining us. And yes, thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conversations. Thank you.
And thanks for having me. Great. Really
thank you so much.